Moore, Oklahoma. Few places on Earth have experienced as many devastating tornadoes as this city. Long before the world witnessed a record-breaking tornado of 1999, Moore had already earned a frightening reputation. In 1893, only weeks after the town was established, a violent tornado swept across the area. Nearly 1.3 miles wide, it carved a destructive path through the young community, killing dozens of people and leaving more than 100 injured. For a town that had barely begun its journey, the disaster was almost unimaginable. Many believed it was simply terrible luck, but history had different plans. Over the following decades, tornadoes continued to strike the region. Storms in 1948, 1950, 1960, and 1973 repeatedly reminded residents that Moore stood directly in one of America's most dangerous tornado corridors. Each time, the city rebuilt. Each time, people hoped the worst was finally behind them. But every rebuilding project also meant more homes, more families, and more lives placed in the path of future storms. By the late 1990s, meteorologists were closely watching a powerful weather pattern developing across the southern plains. What was forming above Oklahoma would soon become one of the most powerful tornadoes ever documented. May 3, 1999. The morning across Oklahoma looked peaceful. Blue skies stretched overhead, and for most people, it felt like an ordinary spring day. But inside the Storm Prediction Center, meteorologists were seeing something completely different. A powerful upper-level trough was pushing in from the west. Warm, moisture-rich air was streaming north from the Gulf of Mexico. At the same time, dry desert air was moving east, creating a dangerous collision of air masses. This combination had all the ingredients needed for violent supercell thunderstorms. Forecasters knew this wasn't a routine severe weather day. As the afternoon progressed, weather models and radar data became increasingly alarming. Around 11 a.m., forecasters upgraded much of the southern plains to a higher severe weather risk. The atmosphere was becoming more unstable by the minute. Powerful winds at different heights in the atmosphere were beginning to rotate. That rotation was exactly what violent tornadoes need to form. Outside, however, most residents continued their normal routines. Children played outside. Businesses stayed open. Traffic moved as usual. Very few people realized they were only hours away from one of the worst tornado disasters in American history. Hook, the sky still looked calm, but invisible forces were preparing a monster that would soon rewrite tornado history. By mid-afternoon, thunderstorms rapidly developed across southwestern Oklahoma. At first, they looked like ordinary spring storms, but radar operators immediately noticed something unusual. One particular storm began strengthening much faster than the others. Meteorologists watched as the storm evolved into a classic supercell, the most dangerous type of thunderstorm capable of producing violent tornadoes. As the storm intensified, emergency officials began issuing severe thunderstorm warnings. Soon afterward, the first tornado warning followed. Storm chasers heading toward the developing supercell could already see a rapidly rotating wall cloud. The atmosphere felt strange. The air was warm, heavy, and almost completely still. Many experienced storm chasers later described that silence as one of the most unsettling moments of the day. Then the first tornado touched down. It wasn't the last. Over the next several minutes, multiple tornadoes formed from the same powerful supercell. Each new tornado showed that the storm was becoming stronger instead of weaker. Meteorologists realized the situation was escalating faster than expected. The storm had already produced several tornadoes, but another circulation was beginning to organize beneath the rotating cloud base. This new circulation looked different. It tightened rapidly. The rotation became more intense with every radar scan. Storm chasers reported that debris had already started rising into the air. The funnel continued growing. Within minutes, it transformed from a narrow cone into a massive wedge-shaped tornado. Its size increased dramatically. Its power continued building, and its path pointed directly toward heavily populated communities. Inside television weather centers, broadcasts switched to continuous live coverage. Meteorologists stopped regular programming and focused entirely on tracking the storm. Every radar update showed the tornado becoming larger and more dangerous. Emergency managers activated warning systems across multiple counties. Sirens echoed through towns as people rushed toward shelters. Some families moved into basements. Others crowded into small interior rooms. Many residents grabbed weather radios and listened carefully for every new update. No one knew just how powerful the tornado would become, but everyone understood one thing. This was no ordinary tornado warning. The next few minutes would decide the fate of thousands of people. Ahead of the storm lay Bridge Creek, and beyond it, Moore, Oklahoma. Neither community knew they were about to face one of the most violent tornadoes ever recorded. The tornado was no longer just a storm. It had become a moving wall of destruction, and its next target was Moore. By this point, emergency warnings were spreading across the region. Meteorologists were watching the radar, storm chasers were tracking the circulation, and television broadcasters were urgently telling people to get underground or move to the safest place available. But the tornado was moving faster than many people could react. As the massive vortex approached the Moore area, its appearance became even more terrifying. Debris was being pulled high into the air, and the darkness beneath the rotating cloud made it difficult to see exactly where the tornado was. Then, the storm began changing. For a brief moment, the tornado weakened. Its circulation narrowed, and the funnel appeared smaller than before. To someone watching from a distance, it might have looked as if the worst was finally passing. But it wasn't. The weakening lasted only a few minutes. Once the tornado crossed the river, the circulation began tightening again. The winds rapidly increased. The tornado strengthened from F2 intensity toward F4 and eventually F5 level destruction. And now, it was heading directly toward some of Moore's most populated neighborhoods. Hook. The tornado had briefly weakened, but that moment of hope was about to disappear. The first major neighborhood in its path was Country Place Estates. The tornado slammed into the area with enormous force. Homes that had been securely built were ripped apart. Vehicles were thrown through the air. Heavy objects became dangerous missiles, flying hundreds of yards from where they had originally been. Residents who had taken shelter inside their homes suddenly found themselves fighting to survive. Some were thrown through walls. Others were buried beneath debris. The destruction was so extreme that, in several locations, almost nothing recognizable remained. The tornado continued moving northeast, and then came another terrifying target, Westmoor High School. Hundreds of people had been inside the school earlier that evening. When the warning came, students, parents, and staff moved into reinforced hallways and other protected areas. They waited as the sound of the storm grew louder. Outside, the parking lot was being transformed into a field of twisted metal. Cars were overturned. Vehicles were thrown across the area. Roofing material and debris were scattered everywhere. But the people inside the school survived. The warnings had given them something incredibly valuable: time. Even a few extra minutes can mean the difference between life and death during a violent tornado. The storm continued. Now it was approaching Interstate 35. Traffic was still moving through the area when the warnings became increasingly urgent. Broadcasters pleaded with drivers to abandon their vehicles and find proper shelter. Cars began stopping. People ran for cover. Some searched for nearby buildings. Others had nowhere safe to go. And this created one of the most dangerous situations of the entire disaster. A number of people attempted to shelter underneath a highway bridge. It might have seemed like protection from the wind, but bridges can become extremely dangerous during violent tornadoes. The airflow around the structure can accelerate dramatically, while debris can be pulled through the opening. The tornado passed through the area with devastating force. Vehicles were destroyed. Roads were covered in debris. Buildings disappeared behind clouds of dust and wreckage. What looked like a place of shelter became a deadly trap for some people caught in the storm. The tornado continued toward the eastern side of Moore. Neighborhood after neighborhood was damaged. Some houses were heavily damaged. Others were completely destroyed. The storm eventually crossed toward the areas around Tinker Air Force Base and Midwest City. By this stage, the tornado was beginning to weaken, but the destruction it had already caused was enormous. After more than an hour on the ground, the tornado finally dissipated. Silence slowly returned, but Moore was almost unrecognizable. Entire neighborhoods had been flattened. Cars were scattered across roads and fields. Power lines were down. Homes had been reduced to piles of debris. Emergency crews immediately began searching through the destruction. They weren't just looking for survivors, they were looking for anyone who might still be trapped beneath the wreckage. The final numbers were devastating. Dozens of people had lost their lives. Hundreds were injured. Thousands of homes and buildings were damaged or destroyed. The financial losses reached an extraordinary level. But the disaster also revealed something important. Warnings could save lives. The continuous coverage from meteorologists and broadcasters had convinced many residents to take the threat seriously. Thousands of people had moved into shelters before the tornado arrived. That decision likely prevented an even greater tragedy, and the science community had gained something else from the disaster. For the first time, mobile Doppler radar had captured extraordinary wind speeds inside a violent tornado. The measurements would become an important part of tornado research for years to come. But more wasn't finished with tornadoes. The city had survived one of the most destructive storms in history. Yet the question remained, would another monster return? Moore's nightmare wasn't over yet. The city had faced devastating tornadoes before, but residents knew that Oklahoma's spring storms could return at any time. For years, Moore continued rebuilding, improving storm shelters, strengthening buildings, and preparing for the next big tornado. Then came May 20th, 2013. It was a Monday afternoon, and summer break was just 4 days away for many students. Families were looking forward to the end of the school year, while meteorologists were watching a powerful supercell developing over Oklahoma. At first, it looked like a normal severe weather day, but the atmosphere was rapidly becoming unstable. Meteorologists warned residents not to take the situation lightly. Conditions were favorable for large, long-track, and potentially violent tornadoes. Moore had already endured unimaginable devastation, but this time, the storm was once again heading directly toward the city. At approximately 2:56 p.m., a tornado touched down near Newcastle. Moving eastward, it rapidly began to intensify. The vortex was growing larger, stronger, and more dangerous. The tornado crossed Highway 37 and moved toward Cleveland County. Its path was now clearly visible. Moore was in danger once again. The tornado crossed the Canadian River and sharply turned toward densely populated neighborhoods. Homes in the path of the massive circulation began to be destroyed. A short time later, the storm reached the area of Briarwood Elementary School. The school was now in direct threat. Inside, children and teachers were following their safety procedures. They moved into bathrooms and other interior areas, hoping the building would protect them. However, outside, the tornado continued to grow stronger. The winds became so violent that even sturdy buildings began to break apart, and debris flew across the entire neighborhood. Then, at approximately 3:19 p.m., the tornado reached Plaza Towers Elementary School. This was to become the most heartbreaking moment of the entire disaster. Dozens of children and teachers were present inside the school. They followed the safety drills they had been taught. They went into hallways and bathrooms and tried to protect themselves from the approaching storm. Then the tornado hit the school. Enormous force struck the building. Walls began to collapse. Debris filled the rooms, and darkness enveloped the entire school. Children began to scream and cry while the building shook around them. Some students became trapped beneath the rubble. Emergency crews rushed toward the school as quickly as possible, but the destruction was so immense that the rescue operation became extremely difficult. The children did what they had been taught, but the building could not withstand the power of the tornado. Rescuers began searching inside the wreckage. Parents rushed toward the school, desperate to find their children. Some called out their children's names, while others stood in shock, unable to understand what had actually happened. Some children were pulled alive from the rubble. Tragically, however, 7 third-grade students did not survive. They had followed safety instructions, but collapsing walls fell upon them. This tragedy shocked the entire country, and the tornado was still moving forward. Nearby neighborhoods were also being devastated. Near 149th Street and Western Avenue, some people tried to take shelter inside a walk-in freezer at a gas station. They thought the heavy structure could protect them, yet the tornado struck with such immense force that the freezer itself was crushed. 3 people lost their lives there, including a woman and her infant. During this time, the tornado headed toward Moore Medical Center. Inside the hospital, doctors and nurses were trying to save patients. Heavy mattresses were placed over people to provide protection from flying debris. Patients who could be moved were taken away from the windows. Then the tornado struck the hospital. A portion of the medical center's roof was blown off. Windows began to shatter. Debris entered the building, and everyone experienced the terrifying power of the storm. Despite the heavy destruction, medical workers continued helping patients. The tornado then moved toward other parts of Moore. Businesses were destroyed. Vehicles began to be tossed through the air. Roads were covered in debris. Buildings that had stood for years turned to rubble in a matter of minutes. The tornado had devastated the school, homes, businesses, and the medical center, but its destruction was not yet over. The storm crossed Interstate 35. Following that, it continued moving through additional neighborhoods and commercial areas. A bowling alley also came into its path. Staff and customers tried to take shelter in restrooms and other enclosed areas as soon as they spotted the tornado. Within moments, the building was severely destroyed. The roof vanished, the walls collapsed, and the entire interior was left exposed to the open sky. At approximately 3:35 p.m., the tornado began to weaken. As it moved toward Lake Stanley Draper, the strength of the circulation started to decrease. Following roughly 40 minutes of destruction, the tornado finally dissipated. The silence that followed was difficult to describe. Residents emerged from shelters to find their city completely transformed. Entire blocks had been destroyed. Homes were reduced to mere foundations. Cars were scattered across streets and fields. Trees were broken and stripped bare. Emergency workers searched through the debris for survivors. The final death toll reached 24 people. Hundreds of people were injured, and damages reached the billions of dollars. Despite the tragedy, Moore once again began rebuilding. This disaster also raised several difficult questions regarding tornado safety. Why did some schools survive while others were completely destroyed? Why did some people manage to escape while others had no safe place at all? And most importantly, how would Moore prepare for the next tornado? Because after all of the city's experiences, one thing was entirely clear: another storm could return, and Moore had to remain prepared. After the destruction of 2013, Moore faced a difficult reality. The city had now experienced some of the most devastating tornadoes in American history, and each disaster had left behind a painful lesson. But Moore did not simply rebuild, it changed. Storm shelters became more common. New buildings were designed with stronger safety measures. Schools began receiving greater attention, especially when it came to protecting children during severe weather. The goal was simple: survive the next storm, because everyone knew another tornado could come. Moore had learned to live with tornadoes, but living with the threat was not the same as escaping it. The history of Moore had become deeply connected to tornadoes. From the deadly storm of 1893, to the destructive tornadoes of the 20th century, to the historic 1999 disaster, and then the tragedies of 2003 and 2013, the city had repeatedly found itself in the path of violent storms. But every disaster also changed the way people prepared. After 1999, many residents installed storm shelters and safe rooms. After 2013, the importance of stronger school shelters became even clearer. The city continued improving its emergency plans, warning systems, and public awareness. Meteorologists also continued studying the storms. The technology used to track tornadoes had improved dramatically over the decades. Radar systems became more advanced. Weather satellites provided better information. Mobile radar teams could move close to storms and collect measurements that were once impossible to obtain. Every new tornado provided scientists with another opportunity to understand how these enormous rotating storms develop and intensify. But there was still one problem. No matter how advanced the technology became, nobody could stop a tornado from forming. The only thing people could do was understand it, warn people about it, and give them enough time to reach safety. That lesson became especially important in Moore. The city was located in one of the most tornado-prone regions of the United States. Spring could bring warm, humid air from the Gulf of Mexico, powerful winds from the west, and atmospheric instability across the plains. When those ingredients came together, conditions could become dangerous very quickly. A peaceful afternoon could transform into a life-threatening situation within minutes. In Tornado Alley, the sky can look completely normal, right before everything changes. For Moore's residents, tornado awareness became part of everyday life. People learned to watch the weather. They learned where their nearest shelter was. Families discussed emergency plans. Schools practiced tornado drills. Businesses prepared their employees. And broadcasters continued to play an important role by communicating warnings as quickly and clearly as possible. The goal was not to frighten people. It was to make sure they understood when the threat was real. Because one of the biggest dangers during severe weather is complacency. If people hear warnings too often without experiencing a direct hit, they may eventually stop taking those warnings seriously. But Moore had learned the hard way that the next warning could be the one that matters most. The city also became a powerful example of resilience. After each disaster, residents returned. They cleaned the streets, they rebuilt their homes, They repaired businesses, they reopened schools, they rebuilt neighborhoods, and slowly, life returned. The scars remained, but so did the community. This was perhaps the most important part of Moore's story. They could issue warnings, but predicting the exact location where a tornado would form remained challenging. A storm could produce one tornado, then weaken. Another circulation could form nearby. A tornado could suddenly intensify. It could also change direction. That unpredictability is what makes these storms so dangerous. For Moore, however, the lessons were no longer theoretical. The residents had seen the consequences themselves. They had watched entire neighborhoods disappear. They had seen schools damaged. They had witnessed cars thrown through the air. They had walked through streets covered in debris. And they had seen families lose everything. Yet, they continued rebuilding. The city became a symbol of survival. Not because Moore was immune to tornadoes. It wasn't. Not because technology could prevent storms. It couldn't. But because the people learned how to respond. They learned that preparation mattered. They learned that warnings mattered. They learned that a shelter could save a life. And they learned that after the storm, rebuilding was possible. But the question that had haunted Moore for generations remained. When would the next tornado come? There was no answer. The atmosphere does not follow a schedule. A tornado does not care how recently a city was hit. It does not care how much money was spent rebuilding. And it does not care how prepared people think they are. When the right conditions develop, the storm can return. That is the reality Moore has lived with for more than a century. And that is what makes the city's story so extraordinary. It is not simply a story about destruction. It is a story about survival, preparation, loss, recovery, and resilience. Moore has been knocked down again and again, but every time it has stood back up. And somewhere beyond the city, the next storm may already be waiting. The story of Moore is not a story that can be measured only by the number of homes destroyed, the lives lost, or the billions of dollars in damage. It is a story about what happens when a community repeatedly faces something more powerful than anything it can control. Tornadoes cannot be stopped. They cannot be negotiated with. And no warning system can guarantee that everyone will survive. But preparation can change the outcome. That is the lesson Moore learned through more than a century of storms. From the first recorded tornado in 1893, to the devastating storms of the 20th century, to the historic May 3, 1999 tornado, Moore became one of the most recognizable cities in Tornado Alley. The 1999 tornado changed everything. The incredible winds measured inside the storm showed scientists just how powerful a tornado could become. The destruction across Bridge Creek in Moore demonstrated what happens when a violent tornado moves through populated areas, and the warnings demonstrated something equally important. People who receive a warning, understand it, and immediately take shelter have a much better chance of surviving. That lesson became even clearer in 2003. The tornado destroyed hundreds of homes, but there were no fatalities in Moore. Storm shelters and safe rooms had already become more common. People knew where to go. They understood the warning, and they acted. The difference between life and death can sometimes be measured in seconds, and Moore learned that lesson the hard way. Then came 2013. The tornado once again showed its incredible power. Homes were destroyed, businesses were damaged, schools were hit, families lost loved ones, and the city once again found itself covered in debris. But even after another devastating strike, Moore did not disappear. The community rebuilt. New schools were constructed with stronger shelters, homes were rebuilt, businesses reopened, and people returned to their neighborhoods. The scars remained, but the city continued moving forward. That resilience is what makes Moore different. The tornadoes became part of its history, but they did not become the end of its history. Today, when severe weather develops over Oklahoma, residents know exactly what it can mean. A thunderstorm can quickly become a supercell. A supercell can develop rotation. Rotation can tighten. And suddenly, a tornado can appear. That is why meteorologists continue watching the atmosphere. They monitor temperature, humidity, wind direction, wind speed, radar signatures, and storm structure. They look for the ingredients that can produce dangerous storms. But even with modern technology, nature remains unpredictable. A tornado can change strength within minutes. It can widen, it can narrow, it can disappear, or it can suddenly become much more violent. That uncertainty is why warnings must always be taken seriously. When the sirens sound, there is no time to wait for confirmation. There is no time to stand outside and watch. There is no time to wonder whether the tornado will actually hit. The safest decision is to go to a designated shelter or an interior room on the lowest possible level, away from windows. Because the next more tornado may not look exactly like the last one. It may take a different path. It may develop at a different time. And it may arrive when people least expect it. Moore's greatest defense was never a wall, a building, or a machine. It was knowledge. Knowledge of the weather, knowledge of the warnings, knowledge of where to shelter, and the willingness to act. The story of Moore also reminds us that disasters are not only about destruction, they are about people. The people who warn others, the emergency workers who enter dangerous areas, the volunteers who search through debris, the neighbors who help strangers, the families who rebuild, and the children who grow up knowing that the sky can become dangerous, but also knowing what to do when it happens. That knowledge is passed from one generation to another, and every generation adds another lesson to the city's history. Moore has been destroyed before, it has been rebuilt before, and if another major tornado comes, the city will face that challenge again. But this time, it will not be the same city it was decades ago. It will be a city with more knowledge, better shelters, better warnings, stronger buildings, and people who understand the danger. The tornado may still be stronger than anything humans can control, but humans can control how they respond. That is the real story. The 1999 tornado was not simply one of the most violent tornadoes ever recorded. It became a turning point. It changed scientific research. It changed tornado warnings. It changed emergency planning. And it changed the way people thought about survival. Moore became a symbol of both destruction and resilience, a place where the sky has repeatedly unleashed its fury, and where people have repeatedly chosen to rebuild. So when the next dark supercell appears over Oklahoma, people will look toward the sky. They will watch the radar, they will listen for the warnings, and they will move to safety. Because Moore has already learned the most important lesson of all. You cannot control the storm. You cannot stop the wind. You cannot change the path of a tornado, but you can be prepared. And sometimes, preparation is what makes the difference between a disaster and a tragedy. The history of Moore is ultimately not about how many times the city was destroyed. It is about how many times it rose again. The tornadoes came, the warnings sounded, the winds tore through neighborhoods, and when the skies finally became quiet, people came back. They searched, they helped, they rebuilt, and they continued living. Because every storm eventually ends, but the strength of the people who survive it can last forever. Moore is still standing, and that may be the most powerful part of its story.